Welcome everyone to this explainer brought to you by Forge College. Today, we're rolling up our sleeves and stepping right onto the engineering floor for a deep dive into Byzantine Fault Tolerance, or BFT. Now, if you've been following along with our capstone project on evaluating consensus mechanisms, well, this is where the rubber finally meets the road. We're going to evaluate these consensus engines, figure out exactly what makes them purr, and honestly, more importantly, what happens when they completely break down. Let's get right into it. So what exactly is BFT? You can think of Byzantine Fault Tolerance like a massive, highly intricate engine. Now imagine this engine is specifically designed to keep running perfectly even when one rogue gear is actively and maliciously trying to sabotage the whole machine. I mean, it doesn't just fail quietly. It spins backwards, it grinds, it sends sparks flying everywhere. BFT is basically the set of algorithmic blueprints that ensures the rest of the engine just smoothly routes around all that chaos and keeps the system moving forward without a hitch. Here is our engineering schematic index for today. We're going to break down these BFT models step by step, starting with the blueprint, digging under the hood, running some stress tests, comparing the big three, and finally getting you ready to build your capstone comparison table. Part 1. The BFT blueprint and project criteria. Now, the absolutely crucial thing to remember here is that these criteria aren't just abstract ideas drawn on some whiteboard. They are these strict, hard and fast engineering standards you'll use to judge the decentralization and resilience of literally any BFT variant. If a protocol fails on safety, boom, your network forks. If it fails on liveness, the whole network stalls out. Everything we're discussing today maps directly back to these specific, measurable metrics. Moving right along to Part 2, Under the Hood Mechanics and our BFT levers. Think about this beautifully simple equation for a second. This classic formula is the absolute load-bearing wall of a classical BFT system. N is your total nodes, and F represents the faulty ones. Essentially, it means you need a network size of at least 3 times the number of faults plus 1 just to maintain consensus. Or, as I personally like to call it, it's the mathematical limit for dealing with that one validator who lies about absolutely everything. Think of these elements as the actual dials on your control panel. If you change any one of these mechanistic levers, say you decide to tweak the quorum size, or maybe you mess around with the cryptographic optimizations, you directly alter the safety margins, the latency, and the practical decentralization of your entire network. It's definitely a delicate balancing act. And this brings us to the O of N squared communication complexity problem. Now, I know that sounds highly academic, right? But just imagine 50 people locked in a room where everyone has to shout at everyone else simultaneously just to agree on what to order for lunch. The noise would be absolutely deafening. In a blockchain, if every single node has to broadcast to every other node, your messaging complexity explodes quadratically as you add participants. The result? Your system's throughput just completely collapses. We also really need to look at leader behavior and view changes. Think about it. If the leader of your consensus round suddenly goes offline, or worse, acts maliciously, the network has to detect it and replace them. Detecting a faulty leader and executing a view change is essentially like firing a bad boss in real time. It requires synchronous timeouts and new view messages, which, as you might guess, comes with some major liveness costs. Your network is essentially stalled out while HR sorts out all the paperwork. All right, Part 3. Let's run some real-world stress tests and look at deployment scenarios. First up on the test block is the enterprise ledger. In a super tight 10-node setup like this, your absolute highest priority is deterministic finality and strictly meeting those service level agreements. You're going to utilize optimistic fast paths for blistering speed. Actually, scratch that. Blistering speed only when the leader behaves. But the trade-off here? Having that small known validator set inherently centralizes your operational control. Basically, you're prioritizing raw speed over broad decentralization. So what happens if we scale things up a bit? Moving to a 50-node consortium, those quadratic messaging costs we talked about earlier suddenly become a massive constraint. To stop everyone from shouting at once, you're pretty much required to use mechanics like threshold signatures to compress that data. But of course, there's always a catch. This optimization introduces new trusted key setup risks and off-chain setup ceremonies, which ultimately is going to drag down your decentralization score. Finally, consider the 21-node hybrid bridge, especially when it's facing targeted adversarial attacks. In this scenario, you have to inspect your network assumptions incredibly carefully. You'll likely be relying on partial synchrony with explicit timeout adaptive recovery just to survive intermittent network partitions. But you've got to watch out. If your commit rule requires a static quorum, a large network split can prevent finality entirely, which leaves your bridge completely stalled. And trust me, no one wants that.
Part 4, the Big Three Showdown. Let's compare these protocols. When evaluating communication models, you can clearly see how PBFT's quadratic all-to-all messaging stacks up against Tendermint-style batched prevotes. And then, notice how both of them compare to HotStuff's highly efficient pipelining. It's an absolutely crucial comparison because a shift in communication directly and heavily impacts both the performance and the practical decentralization of each and every model. Just to highlight a key distinction that really matters in practice, PBFT scales pretty poorly because of that shouting match we mentioned earlier. Literally, every node is talking to every other node. HotStuff, on the other hand, reduces that messaging chaos by routing everything sequentially through a linearized pipeline. It simplifies the math, speeds up throughput significantly, and massively lowers the worst-case cost of having to replace a bad leader. And finally, Part 5, building your table for the capstone artifact. As you start building out your capstone in this program, remember that every single cell needs what we like to call a micro-argument. You can't just list a raw fact and walk away. You've got to connect the machinery to the real-world outcome. First, state the mechanism. Then, show how it actually impacts the rubric. And lastly, explain the system design trade-off. Here is a perfect example. Notice how this explicitly ties a mechanistic feature, in this case the use of threshold signatures, to two totally different outcomes. You get an improved scalability score on one side, but a lower decentralization score on the other due to those centralized setup risks. It tells the whole nuanced story in just one sentence. You're going to use this exact comparison table as your core evidence base in our very next lesson, measuring decentralization trade-offs in practice. So whatever you do, don't just guess. Grab concrete empirical metrics, things like message complexity formulas, documented commit quorums, or measured latencies to actually back up your claims. Data is absolutely an engineer's best friend. So I'll leave you with this. Think carefully about how these mechanics shape the future of your network. Will you prioritize the raw, blazing speed of a small enterprise setup? Or will you choose to navigate the complex, messy governance of a massive consortium? Which consensus engine will you choose? Or is your network going to be the next one to completely stall out? Well, that wraps up our explainer for today. I highly encourage you to visit forge.college to dive deeper into the subject and explore all of our incredible Web3 programs. Keep building, and I will see you in the next one.